The kennel report listed his crime as excessive vocalization, a death sentence for a military working dog. He was too loud for stealth, too broken for service, and scheduled to be put down at dawn. One file folder was enough to pull Lieutenant Marcus Ramirez out of his self-imposed silence. He walked into the kennel, ignored the warnings, and loaded the uncontrollable German Shepherd into his truck. Neither of them knew that this drive would save both their lives. In the weeks that followed, they learned that trauma doesn't always look like silence. Sometimes it looks like a scream that won't stop until someone finally listens. And somewhere in that noise, a silent soldier found his voice again. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The late afternoon sun hung low over the base, casting long golden shadows across the dust-choked motor pool. The heat radiated off the asphalt in shimmering waves, but inside the Humvee the air felt cold and heavy. Lieutenant Marcus "Ghost" Ramirez sat behind the wheel, his grip on the steering 10-2 knuckles white. The engine idled, a low rhythmic rumble that vibrated through the soles of his boots. Marcus was late 20s, with the coiled tension of a spring ready to snap. His dark hair was cut to regulation, and the Navy SEAL patch on his chest sat perfectly straight, though the man beneath it felt crooked. His eyes were brown and carried a haunted intensity, the look of a man who was replaying a movie in his head that no one else could see. He hadn't spoken a word in 3 weeks. Not since Kandahar. Not since the silence became his only way to keep the world safe from his commands. The file on the passenger seat slid slightly as he shifted. Subject: Bear. K9 unit. Disposition: euthanasia. He hadn't planned to intervene. He was barely holding his own career together, fighting a commanding officer who wanted to bench him for psychological unfitness. But when he read the kennel master's note, "Dog refuses to be quiet. Distress calls constant," something in Marcus's chest tightened. He knew what it was like to scream on the inside. Bear was just doing it on the outside. He drove to the kennel on instinct. The facility was sterile, smelling of bleach and anxiety. And there was the noise. A relentless, piercing bark that echoed off the concrete walls. Marcus walked past the other cages straight to the end. Behind the chain link, a German Shepherd with a coat of tan and black was pacing. The dog stopped the moment he saw the uniform. Bear didn't cower. He stood tall, ears alert, and let out a sharp, deliberate bark. It wasn't a plea, it was a report. The kennel master shook his head. "He won't shut up, Lieutenant. We can't deploy a dog that gives away the position. He's broken." Marcus looked at the dog. The dog looked at Marcus. For a long moment, the man who wouldn't speak and the dog who wouldn't stop locked eyes. Marcus saw the scars on the dog's front legs, the hypervigilance in his stance. He didn't see a broken animal. He saw a soldier trying to warn a squad that wasn't there anymore. Marcus knelt. He didn't offer a hand to sniff. He just nodded. Bear tilted his head, the barking ceasing instantly. In the sudden quiet, the air felt thin. Marcus felt the pressure building in his throat, the rust on his own vocal cords. He had to try. "Load up," Marcus rasped. The voice was gravel and used and raw, but it was there. Bear didn't hesitate. He waited for the gate to click open and trotted to the waiting Humvee as if he'd been waiting for that specific order his whole life. The drive back to the barracks was different. The silence wasn't empty anymore. As they rolled through the training grounds, the golden hour light flooding the cab, Bear sat shotgun, sitting up tall in the seat usually reserved for a team leader. He looked at Marcus, panting a happy, open-mouthed grin, his tongue lolling to the side. From the back seat, 2 of Marcus's teammates, men who had been walking on eggshells around him for weeks, started laughing at the sight of the vicious dog sitting like a co-pilot. Marcus looked over at Bear. The dog's ear twitched. For the first time since the explosion, the ghost in the driver's seat faded, and Marcus Ramirez just breathed. "You talk too much," Marcus whispered to the dog. Bear let out a soft whine and rested his chin on Marcus's arm. "Yeah," Marcus replied, a small smile breaking the stoic mask. "Me too." The apartment was a shrine to order, a silent manifesto of a life stripped down to its barest essentials. The living room contained exactly 1 sofa, 1 coffee table centered with geometric precision on a beige rug, and a bookshelf where the spines were aligned by height. There were no photos. No clutter. No dust. It was the home of a man who was trying to control his environment because he could no longer control his memories. Marcus unlocked the door and stepped aside, the heavy metal latch clicking shut with a finality that usually brought him relief. Today, however, he wasn't alone. Bear trotted in, his claws clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor like a tactical metronome. The German Shepherd didn't sniff the perimeter with the casual curiosity of a house pet. He swept the room. Ears swiveling like radar dishes, he moved from the entryway to the kitchen, his body tense, his tail rigid. And then the noise began. It started as a low whine, a high-pitched tea kettle sound escaping from the back of the dog's throat as he inspected the refrigerator. Then a sharp woof at the window. Then a grumble at the couch. Marcus stood by the door, his boots still on, watching the chaos unfold. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the pressure building behind his ribs. Silence was his armor. Silence was safety. But Bear was a grenade rolling around his living room with the pin pulled. The dog circled the coffee table and let out a series of sharp staccato barks at a shadow cast by the blinds. Bark, bark, bark. The sound ricocheted off the bare walls, amplifying in the empty space. Marcus winced. He moved forward, stepping into the dog's line of sight. He raised his hand, palm open, fingers flat, the universal visual command for stay. Bear looked at the hand, then looked at Marcus's face. He tilted his head, his amber eyes narrowing slightly. Then he looked back at the shadow and barked louder. Marcus grit his teeth. He snapped his fingers, a sharp crack, and pointed at the floor. Bear ignored him completely. He trotted over to the hallway leading to the bedroom and let out a mournful, undulating howl that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't just noise, it was a demand. It was a protest against the quiet. Thump, thump, thump. The ceiling shook. The neighbor upstairs. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut. He could feel the judgment vibrating through the plaster. He was the freak in 4B who never said hello, the guy with the scar and the limp, and now he was the guy with the screaming animal. He marched over to the dog, his movements stiff with suppressed agitation. He grabbed Bear's collar, not roughly but firmly, trying to physically guide the dog into a sit. Bear's muscles were like steel cables. He didn't budge. Instead, he twisted his head and let out a frustrated yip right in Marcus's face. The noise was relentless. It scraped against Marcus's nerves like sandpaper. Every bark felt like a breach of his perimeter. His heart rate spiked. 110, 120. His breath came short and shallow. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in, pressing the noise directly into his brain. Bear broke free from his grip and spun around, barking at the front door, then the kitchen, then Marcus. It was a wall of sound, a chaotic barrage that wouldn't stop. Make it stop. Make it stop. The pressure in Marcus's throat became physical pain, a burning sensation clawing its way up. He tried to wave his arms, tried to signal quiet, tried to impose his will through presence. Chapter 1. Breaking the Silence. The apartment was a shrine to order, a silent manifesto of a life stripped down to its barest essentials. The living room contained exactly one sofa, one coffee table centered with geometric precision on a beige rug, and a bookshelf where the spines were aligned by height. There were no photos. No clutter. No dust. It was the home of a man who was trying to control his environment because he could no longer control his memories. Marcus unlocked the door and stepped aside, the heavy metal latch clicking shut with a finality that usually brought him relief. Today, however, he wasn't alone. Bear trotted in, his claws clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor like a tactical metronome. The German Shepherd didn't sniff the perimeter with the casual curiosity of a house pet. He swept the room. Ears swiveling like radar dishes, he moved from the entryway to the kitchen, his body tense, his tail rigid. And then the noise began. It started as a low whine, a high-pitched tea kettle sound escaping from the back of the dog's throat as he inspected the refrigerator. Then a sharp woof at the window. Then a grumble at the couch. Marcus stood by the door, his boots still on, watching the chaos unfold. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the pressure building behind his ribs. Silence was his armor. Silence was safety. But Bear was a grenade rolling around his living room with the pin pulled. The dog circled the coffee table and let out a series of sharp staccato barks at a shadow cast by the blinds. Bark, bark, bark. The sound ricocheted off the bare walls, amplifying in the empty space. Marcus winced. He moved forward, stepping into the dog's line of sight. He raised his hand, palm open, fingers flat, the universal visual command for stay. Bear looked at the hand, then looked at Marcus's face. He tilted his head, his amber eyes narrowing slightly. Then he looked back at the shadow and barked louder. Marcus grit his teeth. He snapped his fingers, a sharp crack, and pointed at the floor. Bear ignored him completely. He trotted over to the hallway leading to the bedroom and let out a mournful, undulating howl that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't just noise, it was a demand. It was a protest against the quiet. Thump, thump, thump. The ceiling shook. The neighbor upstairs. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut. He could feel the judgment vibrating through the plaster. He was the freak in 4B who never said hello, the guy with the scar and the limp, and now he was the guy with the screaming animal. He marched over to the dog, his movements stiff with suppressed agitation. He grabbed Bear's collar, not roughly but firmly, trying to physically guide the dog into a sit. Bear's muscles were like steel cables. He didn't budge. Instead, he twisted his head and let out a frustrated yip right in Marcus's face. The noise was relentless. It scraped against Marcus's nerves like sandpaper. Every bark felt like a breach of his perimeter. His heart rate spiked. 110, 120. His breath came short and shallow. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in, pressing the noise directly into his brain. Bear broke free from his grip and spun around, barking at the front door, then the kitchen, then Marcus. It was a wall of sound, a chaotic barrage that wouldn't stop. Make it stop. Make it stop. The pressure in Marcus's throat became physical pain, a burning sensation clawing its way up. He tried to wave his arms, tried to signal quiet, tried to impose his will through presence alone, but Bear was a creature of combat, and he was waiting for a leader, not a statue. The dog let out another piercing volley of barks, louder this time, desperate. The dam broke. What do you want? The roar tore out of Marcus's throat, raw and jagged. It wasn't a spoken word. It was an expulsion of air and torment that had been trapped in his lungs for 3 weeks. It echoed in the small apartment, bouncing off the sterile walls, hanging in the air like smoke. Instant silence. The world seemed to freeze. Marcus stood in the center of the room, chest heaving, his hands balled into fists at his sides. His throat burned. The sound of his own voice was alien to him, rougher than he remembered, terrifyingly loud. He waited for the ceiling to collapse. He waited for the explosion. He waited for the screams that always followed his voice in his nightmares. But there was only the hum of the refrigerator. Slowly Marcus lowered his gaze. Bear was sitting, perfectly still. His hindquarters were planted on the rug, his front paws aligned. He wasn't cowering. He wasn't afraid. He was looking up at Marcus with an expression of intense, satisfied focus. And then very deliberately Bear's tail thumped against the floor. Once, twice, thump, thump. The dog didn't want silence. He wanted orders. He wanted a handler. Marcus stared at the dog, his breath trembling as it left his lips. The adrenaline was still coursing through him, but now it was mixing with something else, shock. He had spoken. He had shouted. And nobody had died. The room blurred. The beige rug dissolved into the blinding white dust of a Kandahar street. Flashback. The heat was a physical weight pressing down on his Kevlar. The static in his earpiece was the only sound besides the distant pop of small arms fire. Marcus, Ghost, was stacked up outside the mud brick compound, his team behind him. Intel said the HVT was inside. Intel said the civilians were clear. He saw the movement in the window. A silhouette holding something dark. Breach, breach, go loud. Marcus screamed into the comms, his voice the hammer that dropped the anvil. The door blew inward. The concussive blast rattled his teeth. They stormed the room, weapons up, violence unleashed on his command. But there was no return fire. Just the screams. High-pitched, terrified. Not men. Women. Children. The dust settled, revealing the mistake. The silhouette wasn't a rifle, it was a pot. The bodies on the floor weren't insurgents. The wailing rose up, a chorus of grief that drowned out the world, and all Marcus could hear was the echo of his own voice giving the order. His voice was the weapon. His voice was the trigger. End flashback. Marcus blinked, pulling himself back to the cool, dim light of his apartment. He was shaking. His hands trembled where they hung by his sides. He looked down at his left leg, half expecting to see the blood and dust, but there was only clean denim. He sank to his knees. The movement was uncontrolled, a collapse of tension. He sat on the floor, eye level with the dog. Bear didn't rush him. He didn't lick his face or jump. He simply scooted forward, inch by inch, until he was close enough that Marcus could feel the heat radiating from his fur. The dog let out a soft, long exhale through his nose, resting his heavy head on Marcus's knee. The silence that filled the room now wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the last 3 weeks. It was a shared quiet. A truce. Marcus reached out, his fingers hovering over the dog's broad head before finally settling behind the velvet soft ears. He scratched gently. Bear leaned into the touch, closing his eyes, the tension draining from his canine frame. "You're not broken," Marcus whispered. His voice was a rasp like tires on gravel, barely audible. But it was there. Bear opened one eye, looking up at him. "You're just loud," Marcus continued, the words feeling strange and heavy on his tongue. He swallowed the lump in his throat. "You were just trying to get a signal through the jammer." Bear let out a low grumble of agreement, shifting his weight so he was pressing firmly against Marcus's side. The contact was grounding. It anchored Marcus to the floor, to the room, to the present moment. Marcus looked at the uncontrollable dog who had just forced a Navy SEAL to break his own rules. The dog who had been scheduled to die because he wouldn't stop communicating. "Maybe we both need to learn a new language," Marcus murmured to the empty room. He looked at the notepad on the coffee table where he had written his daily schedule, a list of silent tasks to get him through the day. He reached over, grabbed a pen, and flipped to a fresh page. He watched Bear's ears perk up at the sound of the paper turning. Marcus wrote one word: Grizzly. He turned the pad toward the dog. "That's you, Grizzly. Because you're too big to be a bear." The dog stared at the paper, then let out a sharp, inquisitive bark. It wasn't the chaotic noise from before. It was different. Specific. It had a pitch and a cadence that Marcus hadn't noticed until his ears stopped ringing from the panic. Marcus looked at the dog, really looked at him. The bark hadn't been random. When Bear barked at the window, his pitch dropped. When he barked at the shadow, it was staccato. When he barked at Marcus, it was rhythmic. Marcus felt a prickle of curiosity cut through the exhaustion. He had spent his career decoding enemy chatter, reading body language, listening for the snap of a twig in a dark forest. He had been looking at Bear as a problem to be silenced. But what if the kennel master was wrong? What if the noise wasn't noise at all? He picked up the pen again. He needed to know if this was a fluke or a pattern. He needed to know if the dog was just crazy, or if he was trying to tell a story that no one else was smart enough to understand. Marcus tapped the pen against his knee, looking at Grizzly. "Okay," Marcus whispered, his eyes narrowing with the first spark of purpose he'd felt since the explosion. "Let's see what else you have to say." The training yard at 0500 hours was a study in gray. The morning mist clung to the agility obstacles like wet wool, damping sound and blurring the edges of the high fences. The base was still sleeping, but Lieutenant Marcus Ramirez was already 3 pages into his notebook. He sat on a damp wooden bench, a stopwatch in his left hand and a tactical pen in his right. 10 yards away, Grizzly was pacing the perimeter of the enclosure. To an untrained eye, the dog looked agitated, neurotic. To Marcus, who had spent the last 2 hours observing with the same intensity he used to scan for snipers in the Hindu Kush, the dog looked like he was transmitting code. Grizzly stopped at the far corner, staring into the dark tree line beyond the fence. His ears swiveled forward, locking on. Short. Low pitch. Marcus wrote it down, double tap. Low frequency. Directional alert. No escalation. A moment later, a squirrel darted across the top of the fence. Grizzly watched it, his body tightening. He let out a high-pitched yip, followed by a long, undulating whine that ended in a frustrated huff. Marcus noted, target unreachable. Distress signal. Seeking engagement. It wasn't noise. It was a syntax. Marcus looked at the scribbled pages. He had cataloged 4 distinct warning barks, 3 levels of attention demands, and a specific heartbreaking low-register moan that only happened when Marcus stayed quiet for too long. "You're not writing a memoir, are you, Ghost?" The voice was gravel wrapped in velvet. Marcus didn't flinch, but he closed the notebook. Sergeant Linda Vasquez walked out of the mist like she owned it. She was short, stocky, and moved with a terrifying economy of motion. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her fatigues were pressed sharp enough to cut skin. She was the best canine trainer in the division, and she had zero patience for officers who thought stripes on a sleeve equaled knowledge of a dog. She stopped beside the bench, looking at Grizzly. The dog trotted over to her, his tail giving a single, polite wag before returning his gaze to Marcus. "He's analyzing the perimeter," Vasquez said, crossing her arms. "Most handlers think he's just pacing. He's actually checking lines of sight." "He talks," Marcus said. His voice was still rough, a rusted hinge forced open, but it was steady. "Constantly. But it's not random." Vasquez turned her dark eyes on him. "So you figured it out. Took you long enough. Why didn't you tell the kennel master?" Marcus asked, nodding toward the dog. "Why let them schedule him for termination?" Because the kennel master is a bureaucrat who reads manuals, Vasquez spat. He sees a dog breaking noise discipline. I see a dog trying to bridge a comms failure. But I couldn't prove it. And I couldn't find a handler crazy enough to put up with the noise long enough to understand it. She paused, her gaze softening slightly as she looked at the shepherd. Until you. Marcus watched Grizzly sniff the air. Why does he do it, Linda? It's fear-based. I can see the cortisol spike every time it gets quiet. Vasquez sighed, a heavy sound in the morning chill. She sat down on the bench next to him, leaving a respectful distance. You know where he came from? Who had him before? Marcus shook his head. The file had been redacted. Corporal Davis. Good kid. Smart. They were a hell of a team in Anbar, Vasquez began, her voice dropping lower. They were on a solo recon sweep. Davis triggered a pressure plate. It didn't kill him instantly. It took his legs. Knocked his radio out. Marcus felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the mist. They were in a ravine, she continued. Out of visual range. Davis was bleeding out. He couldn't speak. Shock maybe. Or just fading. Grizzly stayed with him. For 6 hours. The recovery team found them after dark. Vasquez looked at Marcus, her expression fierce. The team said they found them because they heard the dog. Grizzly barked for 6 hours straight. He barked until his vocal cords bled. He was trying to call in the medevac that his handler couldn't. He was screaming for help. Marcus looked at the dog. Grizzly was sitting now, watching a leaf blow across the grass, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. But here's the kicker, Vasquez said quietly. Because of mission protocol, radio silence, light discipline, nobody responded for the first 4 hours. They thought the barking was a stray. They ignored it. By the time they investigated, Davis was gone. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow to the gut. The air left his lungs. He thinks silence kills, Marcus whispered. Bingo, Vasquez said. To him, silence means his handler is down. Silence means no one is coming. Silence is the sound of dying. When you go quiet, Lieutenant, he thinks you're bleeding out. He barks to keep you awake. He barks to make sure you're still there. Marcus stared at his hands. For 3 weeks, he had used silence as a shield, believing his voice was a weapon that caused collateral damage. He had shut his mouth to save lives. But to the dog sitting 10 yards away, that very silence was the monster. They were 2 soldiers trapped in opposite nightmares, one running from the noise, the other running from the quiet. He's not broken, Vasquez said, standing up and brushing off her pants. He's desperate for a confirm. He needs a handler who talks back. You want to fix him? You don't train him to be quiet. You train him to trust that you're alive. She nodded at the obstacle course. Show me what you got, Ghost. Marcus stood up. His leg throbbed, the old shrapnel wound reacting to the damp, but he ignored it. He walked to the center of the yard. Grizzly watched him, his body tense, a low whine building in his throat as the silence stretched for 5 seconds. Marcus took a deep breath. He didn't just need to give a command. He needed to give a reassurance. Grizzly, Marcus said. The volume was moderate, but the tone was absolute. The dog's head snapped toward him. The whine cut off instantly. Front. Marcus commanded. Grizzly moved. It wasn't the sloppy, confused movement of the kennel. It was a tactical launch. He sprinted to Marcus and swung his body around, sitting perfectly in front of him, eyes locked on Marcus's face. Heel, Marcus ordered, turning and walking toward the A-frame. Grizzly glued himself to Marcus's left leg. He didn't look at the obstacles. He looked at Marcus. He was waiting for the next sound. Up. Grizzly scaled the A-frame, scrambling over the apex. Down. The dog dropped to his belly on the other side, freezing instantly. Speak. Bark. It was singular. Controlled. Proud. Marcus felt a surge of energy he hadn't felt in months. It was the rhythm of the work. The flow. Action-reaction. Command-execution. But more than that, it was the dialogue. Every time Marcus spoke, Grizzly relaxed. Every time Marcus gave a command, the dog's anxiety evaporated, replaced by purpose. They ran the course for 20 minutes. Sweat broke through Marcus's shirt. His voice, scratchy at first, grew stronger. He stopped whispering. He started projecting. He started sounding like an officer again. Right flank. Hold. Clear. Grizzly moved like an extension of Marcus's will. The constant, neurotic vocalization was gone, replaced by heavy breathing and the occasional sharp bark of confirmation. The dog wasn't noisy, he was responsive. He was just waiting for a signal that the channel was open. They finished at the base of the climbing wall. Marcus was breathing hard, hands on his knees. Grizzly sat beside him, panting, looking up with eyes that shone with pure adoration. Vasquez was watching from the sidelines, a rare, small smile playing on her lips. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Marcus dropped to one knee and grabbed the dog's head in both hands, ruffling the thick fur around his neck. Grizzly leaned in, pressing his forehead against Marcus's chest, right over his heart. "I hear you, Grizzly," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion but clear as a bell in the morning air. "I hear you loud and clear." The dog licked his chin, a wet, rough sandpaper seal of approval. "And you're teaching me to speak again," Marcus added softly. For a moment, it was just the two of them in the mist, a silent man finding his voice and a loud dog finding his peace. But the peace wouldn't last. Across the field, the heavy steel door of the admin building swung open, and the base commander stepped out, flanked by two MPs. He wasn't looking at the sunrise. He was looking straight at Marcus, and he was checking his watch. The 72-hour evaluation clock was ticking, and from the look on the commander's face, he wasn't there to offer a treat. The bond is forming, but the military bureaucracy waits for no one. With the commander approaching and the threat of separation looming, Marcus is about to find out that saving Grizzly might cost him the only career he's ever known. And neither of them knows that miles away, a timer of a different kind has just started ticking for 2 hostages in Syria. The briefing room smelled of stale coffee and high-voltage tension. The only light came from the projector humming overhead, casting a cone of dust motes that terminated on the whiteboard. Lieutenant Marcus Ramirez stood in the back, leaning against the cinderblock wall. His arms were crossed, his posture rigid. He was usually the first one at the table, the one analyzing the topography before the briefing even started. Today he was a spectator, a ghost in the room. Commander Stone clicked a remote, and a grainy surveillance photo appeared on the screen. It showed 2 figures kneeling in the dirt, hands bound behind their backs, flanked by armed men in mismatched fatigues. 0600 hours, intelligence confirmed the location, Stone said, his voice a low monotone that commanded absolute silence. Sarah Chin, American journalist, and her translator, Rashid Al-Fayed. They were taken 3 days ago near the Turkish border. We've been tracking their movements, but the chatter stopped 6 hours ago. Stone clicked again. A map appeared, a tangle of contour lines and red zones in northern Syria. They are being held in a compound here. Stone pointed with a laser to a cluster of buildings in a valley. The window is closing. Intercepts suggest they're being moved to a deeper stronghold in 48 hours. If they cross that ridge, we lose them. We lose them for good. The room was silent. The 6 other men around the table, Tier 1 operators, the best of the best, were already doing the math. Insertion points, extraction routes, kill zones. "We need a 4-man element for insertion," Stone said, scanning the faces of his team. "Standard loadout. Stealth entry. Secure the hostages, exfil to LZ Bravo." Marcus pushed himself off the wall. The movement drew every eye in the room. "I'll take point," Marcus said. The words were quiet, rasping against the silence of the room like sandpaper on steel. But they were clear. For 3 seconds nobody moved. The team stared at him as if a statue had just come to life. Captain Torres, a man who had been Marcus's swim buddy in BUD/S and his brother in every hellhole since, turned slowly in his swivel chair. His face wasn't angry, it was pained. "Ghost," Torres said softly, using the call sign that had taken on a cruel double meaning in the last few weeks. "You haven't spoken a word in 21 days. "I'm speaking now," Marcus replied, his jaw set. "Yeah, you are." Torres stood up, walking over to him. He lowered his voice, keeping it between them, though in the dead quiet of the room, everyone heard. "But leading a team isn't just about giving orders, Marcus. It's about trust. You shut down. You checked out. How do we know you won't freeze up when the shooting starts? How do we know the comms won't go dead again?" It was the question everyone was thinking. Marcus felt the heat rise in his neck. He wanted to shout that he was fine, that he was ready, but the truth was he didn't know. He only knew one thing. The noise in his head got quieter when he was doing his job. "I know the terrain," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady. "I ran ops in that sector in 23. I know the choke points." "We have maps for that," Torres countered gently. "And I have the asset you need," Marcus interrupted. He looked at Stone. "I'm bringing Grizzly." A ripple of unease went through the room. One of the newer guys scoffed. "The psycho dog from the kennels? The one that barks at the wind?" "He doesn't bark at the wind," Marcus said, his voice hardening. "He alerts to threats. He communicates. And in a night op with limited visibility, he'll hear them before we see them. He's a washout, Marcus, Torres said, shaking his head. He's unstable. Just like. Torres stopped himself, but the word hung in the air. Just like you. Marcus took a step forward, closing the distance. He's not a washout. He's a soldier who lost his team. And if we're walking into an ambush, I want the guy who's scared of silence watching my back. Because he's the only one who won't get complacent. Commander Stone cleared his throat. The sound was like a gavel striking a desk. Enough. Stone looked at Marcus. He studied him for a long, uncomfortable moment, weighing the risk. He saw the fatigue in Marcus's eyes, the slight tremor in his hand, but he also saw the fire that had been extinguished for weeks. It was flickering again. You want the lead, Ramirez? Stone asked. Yes, sir. And you vouch for the dog? You put your trident on it? I do. Stone nodded slowly. All right. But we have protocol. You've been flagged for psychological unfitness. I can't clear you for combat based on a hunch. He checked his watch. You have an appointment with Dr. Kim at 0800 tomorrow. You pass that evaluation, you convince her you're not going to crack, and you're on the bird. You fail or she has even one doubt and you're benched. Permanently. And the dog? Marcus asked. If you clear, the dog clears. But if he barks on the approach, Ramirez, if he gives up your position? Stone let the threat hang. It's on you. The sun had set, and the training grounds were bathed in the sickly orange glow of the security floods. Marcus sat in the dirt behind the equipment shed, the most secluded spot on base. Grizzly sat across from him. This was the test. The briefing room was politics. This was survival. Okay, Grizzly, Marcus whispered. We need to work on the volume. Grizzly panted, his tail sweeping the dust. He looked happy, eager. But Marcus could see the tension in the dog's shoulders. The base was quieting down for the night, and with the quiet came the demons. A truck backfired a mile away. Grizzly instantly stiffened. He stood up, hackles rising, and let out a sharp, piercing bark. Quiet, Marcus said instantly. Grizzly ignored him, barking again at the darkness, spinning in a circle. The silence of the night was attacking him, and he was fighting back the only way he knew how. Grizzly, hush, Marcus tried again, snapping his fingers. The dog whined, pacing frantically. He looked at Marcus, his eyes wide. Why aren't you worried? Why aren't you shouting? Something is out there. Marcus realized that standard commands wouldn't work. This wasn't disobedience, it was panic. It was a PTSD feedback loop. Marcus felt a mirror image of that panic in his own chest. The urge to check the perimeter, to find a weapon, to do something. I know, Marcus said softly. He didn't command. He just spoke. I know, buddy. Silence feels dangerous. Grizzly stopped pacing and looked at him. Marcus scooted forward in the dirt. He reached out and placed his hand flat on the center of the dog's chest. He could feel the heart hammering against the ribs. Thump, 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 thump. Too fast. It feels like something is coming, Marcus murmured, keeping his hand firm. It feels like if you stop making noise, the bad thing happens. Grizzly let out a low, trembling whine, leaning into the hand. But I'm here, Marcus said. He took a deep breath, forcing his own heart rate to slow down. He needed to regulate the dog, but to do that, he had to regulate himself. He had to embody the calm he didn't feel. I'm watching. You don't have to shout. I've got the watch. He moved his other hand to Grizzly's muzzle, gently, not clamping it shut, just holding it. A tactile signal. Quiet, Marcus whispered. Trust me. Grizzly trembled. A small woof built up in his throat, a bubble of anxiety trying to pop. Marcus held his gaze. No. Quiet. He waited. 1 second. 2 seconds. Grizzly vibrated. He wanted to bark. He needed to bark. But he looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and saw that the man wasn't gone. The man was right there, solid and awake. The dog let out a long, shuddering breath through his nose. The tension in his chest dropped. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. The crickets chirped. The wind rustled the dry grass. The world didn't end. Marcus kept his hand on the dog's heart. He felt the rhythm slowing. Thump, thump, thump. 20 seconds. Good, Marcus breathed, afraid to break the spell. That's it. We're okay. 30 seconds of silence. It wasn't the empty, terrified silence of the kennel. It was a tactical silence. A shared, deliberate choice to be quiet together. Grizzly licked Marcus's hand, then lay down in the dirt, resting his chin on his paws. He kept his eyes open, watching the dark, but he didn't make a sound. Marcus leaned back against the shed wall, wiping sweat from his forehead. He realized his own hands had stopped shaking. He had spent so much time thinking he needed to fix the dog, but in that moment, forcing himself to be the anchor for Grizzly had forced him to stabilize himself. They were two broken instruments tuning each other. "We can do this," Marcus whispered to the night. But as he looked up at the moon, the reality of the morning crashed down on him. The dog was ready. The dog trusted him. But now, Marcus had to walk into a sterile white office and convince a woman with a notepad that he wasn't crazy, when he wasn't entirely sure himself. Marcus has won the battle for the dog's trust, but the war for his own mind is just beginning. As dawn approaches, Dr. Kim is waiting with questions that will cut deeper than any shrapnel. And one answer, one hesitation, could ground them both while the hostages run out of time. The office of Dr. Rachel Kim was designed to be soothing, which naturally made Marcus feel like he was suffocating. The walls were painted a soft, non-committal blue. A white noise machine hummed in the corner, masking the silence that Marcus had spent 3 weeks carefully constructing. He sat on the edge of the leather chair, his back straight, hands resting on his knees. He didn't look at the doctor. He looked at the window where the blinds were drawn tight. "Lieutenant," Dr. Kim said. Her voice was calm, professional, and utterly relentless. She didn't look up from her file. "You've cleared the physical. Your reflexes are within standard deviation. Your cortisol levels are high, but that's expected." She finally looked up, clicking her pen. "But we're not here to talk about your knees. We're here to talk about your mouth." Marcus said nothing. He breathed in through his nose, out through his mouth. 4 count in, 4 count out. Tactical breathing. "You led a team for 4 years, she continued, leaning back. "Your performance reviews cite your communication as a primary asset. Decisive, clear, commanding. And then 21 days ago you stopped." She waited. It was a professional wait. She was trained to let the silence become heavy enough to crush a patient into speaking. Marcus held the silence like a shield. If he didn't speak, he couldn't say the wrong thing. If he didn't speak, nothing changed. "Why did you stop speaking, Marcus?" The question hung in the air, sanitized and clinical. It stripped away the armor. Marcus felt his throat tighten, the familiar phantom taste of dust and copper filling his mouth. He opened his lips to give the standard answer, shock, fatigue, processing, but the words died before they reached his tongue. And then, from outside the window, muffled by the double-pane glass and the brick wall, came a sound. It was impatient, demanding. It was Grizzly, tied to the bike rack outside the clinic, telling the world he was still there. The corner of Marcus's mouth twitched. "He's not going to stop, you know," Marcus said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the white noise machine. Dr. Kim blinked, surprised by the sudden break. "The dog?" "Grizzly," Marcus corrected. "He doesn't like being left out of the loop." "We're talking about you, Lieutenant." "We are." Marcus turned his gaze from the window to the doctor. His eyes were dark, tired, but the wall behind them had cracked. "You asked why I stopped." "Yes." Marcus listened to the muffled barking continue. It was a lifeline. A reminder that silence wasn't safety. Silence was just emptiness. "Because my voice got people killed." The room seemed to drop in temperature. Dr. Kim didn't write anything down. She just watched him. "It wasn't the intel," Marcus whispered, his gaze drifting back to the floor. "It wasn't the IED. It was me." Flashback. Kandahar. 110 degrees in the shade. The alleyway smelled of sewage and cumin. Marcus was stacked on the door, sweat stinging his eyes. The team was behind him, coiled springs waiting for release. He checked the feed. Thermal showed bodies. Intel said insurgents. The timeline was collapsing. He had a choice. Wait for confirmation or seize the initiative. Speed is security. Hesitation kills. Breach? Marcus shouted. The word was a thunderclap. Go. 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 The breaching charge blew the hinges. The wood splintered. Marcus stormed in, rifle up, his voice still echoing the command that set the violence in motion. But the shapes on the thermal weren't holding AK-47s. They were holding each other. A woman screaming. A child crying. And then, the secondary trigger, a pressure plate under the rug, not set for a soldier but set for anyone who moved too fast. The boom was deafening. The room dissolved into red mist and gray dust. The screaming stopped. And in the ringing silence that followed, Marcus realized that if he had just waited, if he hadn't given the order, if he had just stayed quiet, they would still be breathing. End flashback. Marcus blinked, the sterile blue office rushing back into focus. He rubbed his face with a trembling hand. I gave the command, he said, his voice thick. I opened my mouth and the world ended for them. So I figured, if I don't speak, I can't hurt anyone else. Dr. Kim looked at him for a long time. And now? Outside, Grizzly let out a long melodramatic howl. It sounded ridiculous, like a wolf trying to sing opera. Marcus let out a breath that turned into a short, genuine laugh. It was a rusty sound, but it was real. Now, Marcus said, leaning forward, I have a partner who thinks the quiet is the enemy. If I don't speak to him, he thinks I'm dead. He thinks he's alone. So the dog is a therapy tool? Dr. Kim asked, her pen hovering over the paper. No, Marcus said firmly. He stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. The dog is truth. He survived his trauma by making noise. He screamed for help until someone found him. Maybe I need to learn from him. Maybe keeping it inside is what actually kills you. Dr. Kim capped her pen. She looked at the lieutenant, then at the window where the barking was still rhythmic, persistent. I can't clear you as healed, Marcus, she said. You have deep lacerations on your psyche that are going to take years to scar over. Marcus nodded. I know. But, she signed the bottom of the form. I can clear you as functional. You have a coping mechanism. You have an anchor. She tore the sheet off and handed it to him. Don't lose that dog, Lieutenant. I think he's the only reason you're standing in this office and not in a psych ward. Marcus took the paper. Yes, ma'am. He walked out the front door into the blinding sunlight. Grizzly was there, straining at the leash, panting. When he saw Marcus, he didn't bark. He just stood up, wagged his tail once and looked ready to work. You're a pain in the ass, Marcus told the dog affectionately, unclipping the leash. Grizzly sneezed. Let's go to work. The next 6 hours were a blur of motion and sound. The montage of their integration wasn't set to music. It was set to the rhythm of Marcus's voice and the slap of paws on pavement. They moved to the urban combat simulator, a kill house made of plywood and tires. Grizzly, search. Marcus commanded. His voice was strong now, projecting from the diaphragm. The dog shot into the room, nose to the ground. He swept the corners, checked the blind spots. Clear. Marcus shouted to the empty doorway, practicing the volume. Grizzly moved to the next door and froze. He sat down, staring at the handle. A passive alert. Hold, Marcus signaled. He moved up, checking the door. It was rigged with a tripwire. Good boy, Marcus whispered. Leave it. Heal. They moved as a single organism. Where Marcus looked, Grizzly looked. When Marcus stopped, Grizzly froze. The chaotic noise of the kennel was gone, replaced by a sophisticated language of barks, whines, and silence. One bark for a target. A low growl for danger. Silence for stealth. On the catwalks above the kill house, the rest of the team watched. Captain Torres stood with his arms crossed, chewing a toothpick. Look at that, the team sniper murmured. The dog clears the fatal funnel before Ramirez even steps in. He's not just clearing it, Torres noted. He's waiting for Ramirez to give the go. They're linked. Down in the pit, Marcus signaled a breach. Move up. Grizzly surged forward, then stopped instantly on a hand signal. Marcus moved past him, covering the angle. It was fluid. It was professional. It was lethal. The skepticism in the team was evaporating, replaced by the cool, professional calculation of operators recognizing an asset. They didn't see a broken man and a noisy dog anymore. They saw a weapon system. They finished the run in record time. Marcus exited the structure, sweat soaking his shirt, Grizzly trotting at his heel with a toy in his mouth. His reward. Torres leaned over the railing. Hey, Ghost. Marcus looked up, shielding his eyes from the sun. Not bad, Torres yelled down. But can he do it with live rounds and the brass watching? Marcus patted Grizzly's head. We're about to find out. Get some chow, Torres ordered. Final simulation is at 1900. The commander wants to see if you crack under pressure before he puts you on that plane. Marcus nodded. He felt good. He felt ready. But as he walked back to the barracks, Grizzly stopped. The dog turned his head toward the setting sun, ears twitching at something carried on the wind, something too faint for human ears. A low, uneasy rumble started in Grizzly's chest. Marcus stopped. What is it? Grizzly didn't look at him. He stared at the horizon, the fur on his neck standing up. It wasn't the training course he was sensing. It was something else. A premonition. Marcus has cleared the doctors and won the team's attention, but the final test isn't just an exercise. The simulation is designed to break him, to recreate his worst nightmare. And as night falls, Neither Marcus nor Grizzly realizes that the game they are about to play is going to feel terrifyingly real, and a ghost from Kandahar is waiting in the dark to see if Marcus will scream or freeze. The kill house was officially known as Structure B, but everyone called it the Butcher Shop. It was a sprawling maze of plywood, cinder block, and darkened corridors designed to mimic the exact layout of the target compound in Syria. Tonight, the safety lights were cut. The only illumination came from the green phosphorescent glow of night vision goggles and the occasional strobe of a simulated muzzle flash. Marcus crouched at the breach point, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm that felt dangerously fast. He adjusted his headset. The silence in his ear was heavy, waiting to be filled. "Alpha team, sound off," Marcus whispered. "Alpha 1 set," Torres's voice crackled. "Alpha 2 set. Alpha 3 set." Marcus looked down. Grizzly was a dark shape beside his knee, virtually invisible in the shadows except for the faint glint of his eyes reflecting the ambient light. The dog was vibrating with anticipation, but he was silent. "Execute," Marcus commanded. The word left his mouth without hesitation. The team moved. It was a fluid, deadly ballet. They breached the first door, the thud crack of suppressed sim rounds tearing into cardboard targets. "Clear left," Torres called. "Clear right," Alpha 2 echoed. They moved deeper into the structure. The air smelled of stale sawdust and the acrid bite of pyrotechnics. Marcus stayed in the center of the formation, Grizzly glued to his leg. This was the test. Marcus wasn't just a shooter, he was the conductor. His voice was the link between survival and chaos. "Hallway long," Marcus directed, his voice steady. "Alpha 2, cover the T intersection. Torres on me. We're moving to the HVT room." Everything was going perfectly. The muscle memory took over. The commands flowed. Move. Hold. Cover. Clear. Then the script flipped. As they stepped into the main courtyard, a wide, open space littered with debris, a blinding flash erupted to their left. It was a training charge, a flashbang simulator designed to disorient, but the sound engineer had cranked the decibels to mimic a 155mm shell. Boom. The world turned white. The concussion wave slapped Marcus in the chest. In an instant, the plywood walls dissolved. The cool night air of the training range turned into the stifling heat of Kandahar. The smell of sawdust became the smell of burning rubber and iron. Marcus froze. He stood in the middle of the open ground, his rifle raised, but his mind had severed the connection to his body. He was back there. He was watching the building collapse. He was hearing the screams that weren't there. Ghost status. Torres's voice screamed in his earpiece. "We have contact left. Call the play." Silence. Marcus's mouth was open, but no sound came out. The mute button in his brain had been slammed down. The silence was a physical weight, crushing his windpipe. He could see his team scrambling, looking back at him, confused. They were waiting for a command. They were waiting for his voice. And because he was silent, they were dying. "Ghost, talk to me." The panic in the headset was rising. The simulation op for opposing force, soldiers were pouring fire on them. The team was pinned. Bark, bark, bark. The sound was sharp, percussive, and right next to his leg. It didn't sound like a dog. It sounded like a drill sergeant. Marcus blinked. The 3 barks, the alert pattern they had practiced, cut through the ringing in his ears. He looked down. Grizzly wasn't cowering. He wasn't looking at the explosion. He was looking up at Marcus, barking directly at him, then snapping his head toward the enemy position. "Bark. Wake up. Bark. I'm here. Bark. Lead me." The anchor held. The dog's voice dragged Marcus out of the past and slammed him back into the present. The white flash faded. The plywood walls returned. Marcus sucked in a breath that felt like jagged glass. He shook his head violently. "Contact left." Marcus shouted, his voice cracking but loud. "Suppressive fire. Alpha 2 flank right. Torres, smoke out." The team instantly snapped back into action. The confusion vanished. "Moving," Torres yelled. They pushed forward, driving the op for back. Marcus's heart was still racing, his hands slick with sweat, but he kept talking. He narrated every move, forcing the words out to keep the silence at bay. Grizzly search. The dog surged ahead, nose working the air. They approached the final door, the hostage room. The team stacked up. Standard procedure was to kick and clear. But Grizzly stopped. He didn't sit. He didn't bark. He dropped into a low crouch 5 feet from the door and let out a menacing, vibrating growl that Marcus felt in the soles of his boots. He pawed frantically at a pile of innocent-looking trash near the doorframe. "Hold!" Marcus screamed. "Hold position. We have to breach, clock is ticking." Alpha 2 argued. "Negative," Marcus yelled. "Trust the dog. It's a trap." He ran forward, dropping to a knee beside Grizzly. He shined his light where the dog was pawing. Hidden under a burlap sack, barely visible, was a tripwire connected to a massive bank of C4 simulators. If they had kicked that door, the entire team would have been killed. "IED on the breach," Marcus called out, his voice rock steady now. "Secondary entry point. Window 3 o'clock. "Copy," Torres said, breathless. They bypassed the trap door. They hit the window. "Flashbangs in, clear the room, secure the hostage dummy." Index. Index. The loudspeaker boomed overhead. The floodlights slammed on, washing the kill house in blinding white illumination. Marcus slumped against the wall, sliding down until he hit the dirt. He ripped his headset off. His hands were shaking uncontrollably now that the adrenaline was dumping. Grizzly trotted over, a tennis ball appearing magically in his mouth from one of the trainer's pockets. He dropped the slimy ball in Marcus's lap and nudged his hand. "Game over. We won." Captain Torres walked over, wiping soot from his face. He looked at the tripwire by the door, then at Marcus. "I thought we lost you there, Ghost," Torres said quietly. "After the blast, you went dark." Marcus nodded, unable to lie. "I went back. For a second." "Yeah," Torres said. He looked at the dog, who was currently chewing on the tennis ball with happy, squeaky abandon. "But you came back. That dog, that bark, it snapped you out of it." "He called me on it," Marcus whispered, stroking Grizzly's ears. "And that ID," Torres shook his head. "We would have been pink mist. He saved our asses." Commander Stone walked into the kill house, stepping over the simulated debris. He stopped in front of Marcus. The commander's face was unreadable, stone cold as always. He looked at the tripwire. He looked at the stopwatch. "You froze," Stone said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." Marcus stood up, coming to attention. "For 4 seconds." Stone paused. "And then you recovered. And you successfully identified a threat that would have wiped out the unit." Stone looked down at Grizzly. The dog paused his chewing and looked up, ears perked. "The dog clears," Stone said. "And so do you, Lieutenant. Wheels up at 0400. The barracks were quiet. It was 0200 hours. The rest of the base was asleep, but Marcus sat at the small desk in his quarters, the only light coming from a small tactical lamp. A piece of lined paper sat in front of him. He held a pen, hovering over the words. "To my mom, if you are reading this, it means the silence finally caught up to me." It was the letter every operator wrote before a deployment. The just-in-case letter. He had written a dozen of them over the years. Usually they were routine. This time his hand felt heavy. He looked over at the bunk. Grizzly was sprawled out on top of Marcus's sleeping bag, taking up more than his fair share of the narrow bed. The dog was deep in REM sleep. His paws twitched, running through a dream field. Suddenly, Grizzly let out a high-pitched whimper. His brow furrowed. He let out a muffled, sleeping bark, a sound of distress. Marcus put the pen down. He walked over to the bunk and sat on the edge. He knew that dream. He knew exactly what Grizzly was seeing. The explosion, the falling handler, the silence that followed. "I know, buddy," Marcus whispered, placing a hand on the dog's flank. "I see them too." Grizzly sighed in his sleep, the touch grounding him even in his dreams. His breathing slowed. He settled. Marcus looked at the half-written letter on the desk. He realized he wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of leaving the dog alone in the silence again. "We're going back to war, Grizzly," Marcus said to the sleeping animal. "Together." He crumpled the letter. He didn't need to say goodbye. He wasn't planning on leaving. He lay down on the sliver of mattress the dog had left him, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow they would be in Syria. Tomorrow the bullets would be real. Tomorrow the silence wouldn't be a test, it would be a weapon. As Marcus drifted off, his hand resting on the dog's fur, he didn't know that the mission profile had already changed. The intelligence was wrong. The hostages weren't just being moved, they were being used as bait. And the trap waiting for them in the valley wasn't just an IED, it was something much, much worse. The interior of the MH-60 Black Hawk was a vibrating cage of red light and deafening noise. The rotors slashed through the night air, creating a rhythmic thumping that vibrated in the marrow of Marcus's bones. He sat near the door, boots resting on the grate, watching the Syrian landscape rush by below, a dark ocean of jagged hills and dry riverbeds. The team was a collection of shadows. Captain Torres sat across from him, checking the action on his suppressed carbine. Beside Torres was Sergeant Linda Vasquez, who had traded her instructor's polo for full battle rattle. She had insisted on coming. "The dog answers to you, Lieutenant," she'd said on the tarmac, "but if he malfunctions in the field, I'm the only mechanic who can fix him." Marcus looked down at the mechanic's work. Grizzly sat between Marcus's legs, strapped into a specialized jump harness attached to the floor. He wore tactical hearing protection, muffs, and ballistic goggles that gave him the appearance of a futuristic insect. Most dogs would be shaking. The vibration of a helicopter usually sent cortisol levels through the roof. But Grizzly was asleep. His chin rested heavily on Marcus's thigh, his breathing slow and even against the roar of the engines. Marcus placed a gloved hand on the dog's head. He realized with a jolt of clarity why the dog was calm. It wasn't because Grizzly loved flying, it was because Grizzly was touching Marcus. The anxiety transfer had reversed. In the kennel, Marcus's silence had terrified the dog. Here, amidst the chaos of war, Marcus's calm was the dog's anchor. 2 minutes to LZ, the pilot's voice crackled over the comms. Marcus tapped Grizzly's shoulder. "Wake up, soldier." The dog's eyes opened behind the goggles. He didn't startle. He stood up, shaking out his fur, and looked at the open door. He could smell the change in the air pressure. He knew what was coming. The bird flared, the nose pitching up as they descended into a bowl of darkness 5 clicks from the target compound. The wheels touched the dust with a jarring thud. "Go, go, go." Marcus moved. He didn't have to drag the dog. Grizzly surged forward, leaping from the bay into the swirling dust cloud. They hit the ground running, moving to the perimeter to pull security while the bird lifted off. Within seconds, the helicopter was gone, swallowed by the night. The silence that rushed back in was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of enemy territory. Marcus adjusted his night vision goggles. The world turned into a green phosphor dream. He scanned his sector. "Sound off," Marcus whispered. "Alpha 1, up. Alpha 2, up. Vasquez, up." "Grizzly," Marcus said, his voice barely a breath. "Focus." The dog stood beside him, ears swiveling. He wasn't looking at Marcus now, he was working. He sampled the wind, his nose twitching. He looked back at Marcus and gave a single silent tail wag. "Clear." "We move," Marcus signaled. They moved in a ranger file, Marcus and Grizzly on point. The terrain was brutal, loose scree and scrub brush that threatened to snap underfoot. They moved with the slow, deliberate pace of predators. "Search," Marcus murmured. Grizzly extended the lead to 10 feet. He moved like smoke. No panting. No jingling tags. He flowed over the rocks, pausing every few meters to look back, checking in. "I'm here. You're here. We're good." Marcus felt a surge of confidence that he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just that he was back in the field, it was the connection. He wasn't shouting commands into a void. He was whispering to a partner who heard everything. They reached the ridge overlooking the compound after 40 minutes of humping the rough terrain. Marcus signaled a halt. He crawled to the edge, dropping into the prone position. Grizzly belly crawled beside him, mimicking the posture perfectly without being told. Marcus raised his optic. The compound was a cluster of 3 low buildings surrounded by a mud brick wall. 2 sentries patrolled the roof of the main structure. A light flickered in a window on the ground floor. "Torres," Marcus whispered. "Target verification?" "Thermal confirms heat signatures in the northeast corner room," Torres replied, his voice tight in the earpiece. 2 stationary. "That's our hostages. Plus 6 tangos visible. 2 on the roof, 4 in the courtyard." "Copy," Marcus said. "We infiltrate via the south wall. Breach point Delta. Quiet entry. We grab them and vanish before they know we were here." He looked at Grizzly. "Ready?" The dog was staring intently at the scrub brush to their left, away from the compound. It happened in a split second. Grizzly didn't bark. He didn't jump. He simply went rigid. A low, vibrating rumble started deep in his chest, a sound so low it was felt rather than heard. It was the growl of a tectonic plate shifting. Marcus froze. He didn't question it. He didn't look for a target he couldn't see. "Freeze," Marcus hissed into the comms. "Hold position. Down." The team dropped instantly, blending into the shadows of the ridge. Vasquez, 10 feet back, started to whisper, "What is?" Marcus cut her off with a sharp hand signal. Silence. For 10 agonizing seconds there was nothing. Just the wind and the green static of the goggles. Marcus watched Grizzly. The dog's hackles were a razor-wire ridge along his spine. He was staring at a dark depression in the earth, a dry creek bed about 20 meters from their flank. Then movement. A patrol emerged from the creek bed. 3 men. AK-47s slung low, cigarettes glowing like fireflies in the dark. They weren't part of the compound guard. They were a roving perimeter patrol that intel hadn't spotted. They were walking straight toward the team's position. Marcus gripped his rifle, his fingers sliding to the trigger. If they engaged now, the element of surprise was gone. The compound would lock down. The hostages would be executed. The patrol came closer. 15 meters. 10 meters. Grizzly was a statue. He was close enough to smell the tobacco smoke. Every instinct in a dog is to defend, to bark, to warn. But Grizzly understood the mission. He understood the stakes. He pressed his body flat into the dirt, his eyes locked on the boots of the enemy soldiers. One of the insurgents stopped. He looked toward the ridge. He adjusted his rifle strap, squinting into the darkness. Marcus held his breath. He could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his ears. Grizzly didn't make a sound. He didn't even breathe. The insurgent shrugged, said something in Arabic to his friend, and they kept walking. They passed within 6 feet of where Marcus and Grizzly lay hidden. They walked over the ridge and disappeared into the night. Marcus waited a full minute. He didn't move until Grizzly let out a long, soft exhale and the ridge of fur on his back settled. The dog turned to Marcus and nudged his hand with a wet nose. A soft, high-pitched whine escaped him. All clear. Good boy, Marcus breathed, the relief washing over him like cold water. You are a very, very good boy. Damn, Torres whispered over the comms. I didn't see them until they were on top of us. That dog is a ghost. He's better than a ghost, Marcus replied, his voice steady and commanding. He's our eyes. Marcus pushed himself up. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. The patrol was the variable that could have ended the mission. They had passed the test. All right, Marcus said, his tone shifting from whisper to command presence. We have our window. Vasquez, watch our 6. Torres on me. Grizzly, lead the way. They moved down the slope toward the compound walls. Marcus felt the rhythm return, the seamless integration of man, weapon, and dog. He wasn't the broken lieutenant who feared his own voice. He was the team leader, and he was taking his pack to the hunt. They reached the wall. Marcus stacked up, checking the breach point. He looked down at Grizzly. The dog was staring at the door, tail stiff, body coiled. But as Marcus reached for the handle, Grizzly didn't look at him. He looked through the wood. And for the first time since they left the helicopter, the dog's ears pinned back against his skull, and he took a slow, hesitant step backward. It wasn't a warning of a patrol. It was fear. Marcus paused, his hand hovering over the latch. The dog had cleared the patrol with nerves of steel. Why was he hesitating now, right at the objective? Ghost, we're burning daylight, Torres whispered. Breach. Marcus looked at the door, then at the terrified look in his dog's eyes. Something was wrong. The silence inside the compound wasn't empty. It was waiting. The hesitation lasted a heartbeat. Grizzly's ears were pinned, his body vibrating with a frequency that Marcus felt through the floorboards, but the mission clock was bleeding out. Marcus placed a hand on the dog's shoulder, squeezing once, a signal of shared burden. I know, but we go anyway. Execute, Marcus whispered. The breach was surgical. No explosions, no shouting. Alpha 2 picked the lock, and the door swung inward on well-oiled hinges. They flooded the room like water, silent, fluid, inevitable. The ground floor was empty of tangos, but heavy with the scent of unwashed bodies and old tobacco. Grizzly took point, his nose working the air. He didn't look at the furniture. He looked at the negative spaces, the corners where death likes to hide. He swept left, then paused at a closed door, letting out a low, guttural huff. Marcus signaled Torres. Enemy inside. They bypassed the room, leaving a claymore mine at the door handle as a parting gift for anyone who tried to follow. They moved up the stairs, the wood groaning under the weight of their gear. On the landing, Grizzly stopped again. He looked at the third door on the right. His tail gave a single, distinct thump against the wall. Objective. Marcus stacked up. He looked at Torres. 3, 2, 1. They kicked the door. Inside, the room was small and smelled of fear. 2 figures were huddled in the corner, shielding their eyes from the blinding tactical lights. U.S. Navy. Marcus barked, his voice filling the room. Hands? Let me see your hands. The woman looked up. Sarah Chin looked like she had been through hell, her face bruised, her clothes torn, but her eyes were fierce. She didn't cower. She shielded the man beside her, Rashid, the translator, whose leg was wrapped in bloody rags. "About time," Sarah rasped, squinting into the light. "We're moving," Marcus said, cutting the zip ties on her wrists with a strap cutter. "Can he walk?" "He can limp," Sarah said, pulling Rashid up. "But we need to go." "No. They changed the guard in 5 minutes." "We're already gone," Marcus replied. He tapped his headset. "Alpha 1 to command. Package secured. Moving to exfil point Bravo. Copy Alpha 1. Drone is overhead. You have." The radio transmission was cut short by a sound that tore through the night like a physical wound. "WHRE, WHRE." A klaxon. An electronic shriek echoed through the compound. They hadn't tripped a wire. Someone had seen them on a camera they missed, or the patrol outside had found the dead silence of the perimeter too suspicious. "Contact front." Vasquez yelled from the hallway. The silence was over. The war was on. "Move, move, move," Marcus shouted. The hallway erupted in gunfire. Bullets chewed through the plaster, sending clouds of white dust into the air. The suppressed thwip-thwip of the SEALs' carbines was drowned out by the thunderous crack-crack of AK-47s firing from the courtyard below and the stairwell above. "Suppressing fire," Marcus roared. His voice wasn't the tentative rasp of the clinic, it was a weapon of command. "Vasquez, take the rear. Torres, get the package down the stairs. Grizzly, guard." Grizzly didn't need the order. He slammed his body against Sarah's leg, hurting her away from the exposed window, his teeth bared, barking a furious, rhythmic cadence that cut through the gunfire. He wasn't scared anymore. The fight was here and the fight made sense. They fought their way down the stairs, a moving phalanx of lead and noise. Marcus was at the front, firing controlled bursts, dropping an insurgent who appeared at the landing. "Clear," Marcus yelled. "Go." They hit the ground floor. The courtyard was a kill zone. Rounds were sparking off the stone floor. They needed the back exit, a heavy steel door that led to the alleyway and the escape route. The back door. Torres screamed over the din, "It's our only way out." "Go, go." Torres grabbed the handle of the steel door. Breaching. Bark, bark, bark. Grizzly broke formation. He launched himself not at the enemy but at Torres. He slammed his chest into the captain's legs, nearly knocking him over. "Get off." Torres yelled, trying to shove the dog away. "We have to move." But Grizzly wouldn't move. He spun around and faced the door, the exit that represented their only salvation, and unleashed a sound Marcus had never heard before. It wasn't a bark, it was a scream. A high-pitched, frantic shriek of pure terror. He clawed at the wall next to the doorframe, ripping at the plaster, snapping his jaws at Torres's hand every time he reached for the latch. "He's panicked," Vasquez yelled, firing a burst down the hallway to keep the insurgents back. "He's lost it, Marcus. Drag him." "No," Marcus shouted. The team froze. Bullets impacted the wall 3 feet above Marcus's head, showering him in debris, but he didn't look at the enemy. He looked at the dog. Grizzly wasn't cowering. He was blocking the path. He was looking at Marcus with wild, desperate eyes, pawing frantically at a specific spot on the doorframe where the plaster was slightly discolored. "Ghost, we are sitting ducks." Torres screamed. "Open the door." Marcus looked at the door. It was the logical choice. It was the plan. Every instinct screamed to run through it, but the dog was screaming stop. "Wait." Marcus bellowed, throwing his arm out to stop Torres. "Trust the dog." Marcus dropped to a knee, ignoring the incoming fire. He looked where Grizzly was pawing. He ripped a chunk of loose plaster away from the frame. There, embedded in the brickwork, was a receiver. A thin, translucent wire ran from it, threaded through the hinge of the door. It wasn't just a door. It was a pressure trigger. The moment that handle turned, the entire door frame, rigged with unseen explosives inside the wall, would have turned into a claymore, shredding everyone in the fatal funnel. "ID." Marcus screamed, the realization turning his blood to ice. "Back. Get back. It's rigged." Torres recoiled as if the door were red hot. "Holy." "Secondary," Marcus commanded, his voice booming over the chaos. "Window. 3 o'clock. We go through the wall." "Vasquez, blow the wall." Vasquez slapped a breaching charge on the brickwork next to the window. "Fire in the hole." Boom. The wall disintegrated. The team poured through the hole into the alleyway, coughing in the dust, dragging the hostages with them. As they cleared the building, a rocket-propelled grenade slammed into the front entrance they had just abandoned, shaking the earth. If they had been 5 seconds slower or if they had taken the door. Marcus pulled Grizzly through the rubble. The dog was sneezing, covered in dust, but he was calm again. He looked up at Marcus, tail wagging once. "I told you." Marcus stared at the dog, then at the smoking hole where the door had been. The realization hit him harder than the recoil of his rifle. For 3 weeks he had believed that his voice killed people. He had believed that making noise, giving orders, and taking charge led to death. But tonight, silence would have killed them. If Grizzly had been well-behaved and quiet, they would be dead. If Marcus had stayed silent and let Torres open that door, they would be dead. His voice didn't cause death. His voice, and his willingness to listen to the right voice, had just saved 6 lives. "You crazy son of a bitch," Torres panted, looking at the dog with wide eyes. He knew. He actually knew. "Move," Marcus said. His voice was grim, but the haunting echo was gone. It was just a soldier's voice now. "We're not out yet. We have 2 clicks to the LZ and half of Syria waking up to kill us." He slapped his thigh. "Grizzly, heel. Take us home." The dog fell in beside him, and they sprinted into the dark alleyways of the city. But the city wasn't sleeping anymore. Lights were snapping on in the buildings above them. Shadows were moving on the rooftops. And deep in the distance, the heavy thrum of a vehicle-mounted heavy machine gun began to tear through the night. They had escaped the trap, but they had walked straight into the hunt. And between them and the helicopter lay 2 miles of open hostile ground where there was nowhere to hide, and silence was no longer an option. The extraction was a blur of motion, dust, and the rhythmic percussion of chaos. The city wasn't just waking up, it was screaming. They moved through the labyrinth of back alleys like a single, desperate organism. Marcus took point, his rifle swiveling with robotic precision, but his eyes were glued to the low shape moving 3 meters ahead. Grizzly was the compass. In the confusing tangle of mud brick walls and debris-choked streets, the dog didn't need a map. He followed the path of least resistance, sensing the voids in the enemy's perimeter that no satellite feed could detect. "Keep moving. Keep moving," Marcus commanded, his voice raw but steady. Behind him, Captain Torres and Alpha 2 were practically carrying Rashid, the translator, whose injured leg dragged through the dust. Sarah Chin ran alongside them, her face grim, clutching a discarded AK-47 she had picked up, though she didn't fire it. Vasquez covered the rear, walking backward, her carbine spitting controlled bursts at the shadows chasing them. "Ghost, we have technicals moving on the main road parallel to us," Vasquez shouted into the comms. "They're trying to cut us off." "We're not taking the road," Marcus yelled back. "Grizzly, go. Find the gap." The dog scrambled up a pile of rubble where a wall had collapsed. He paused at the top, silhouetted against the burning skyline, and looked back. He didn't bark. Silence was still their best armor here, but he dipped his head urgently. "This way." They scrambled over the debris, sliding down into a dried riverbed that cut through the outskirts of the town. It was a trench, offering cover, but it was also a funnel. "LZ is 2 mics out," the pilot's voice crackled in Marcus's ear. "We are taking small arms fire. I can give you 30 seconds on the ground, Ghost. 30 seconds or we wave off." "We'll be there," Marcus promised. They sprinted along the riverbed. The air burned their lungs. The sound of heavy machine gun fire, the terrifying thump-thump-thump of a DSHK, echoed off the canyon walls, getting closer. They rounded the final bend and the riverbed opened up. There it was. The landing zone. A flat stretch of hard-packed earth 200 meters away. But between them and the LZ was a killing field. No cover. No shadows. And on the ridges overlooking the open ground, muzzle flashes sparkled like deadly camera strobes. The enemy had anticipated the exit. They were pinned. "Contact front," Torres yelled, dropping to a knee behind a boulder. Bullets kicked up geysers of dirt around them. The team dove for cover behind the meager protection of the riverbank lip. "We can't cross that," Vasquez shouted, changing magazines. "It's a shooting gallery. Bird is inbound." "I see lights," Alpha 2 yelled. The roar of the Black Hawk grew louder, a thundering beat over the staccato gunfire. But the helicopter couldn't land in a crossfire. If they didn't suppress the ridge or if they didn't move now, the pilot would abort. Marcus stared at the open ground. 200 meters. 20 seconds of sprinting. Time seemed to warp. The sound of the battle faded into a dull roar. Marcus looked at the tracers arcing through the night sky. Flashback. Kandahar. The alleyway. The choice. If he moved, they might walk into a trap. If he waited, they might lose the target. In the memory, he opened his mouth. He screamed, "Breach!" And the world exploded. He saw the dust. He saw the small shoe in the rubble. Present day. The paralysis seized him. It wasn't physical, it was a frost that coated his soul. If he ordered them to run and one of them took a bullet, if Sarah died, if Torres died, if the dog died, it would be his voice that killed them. Again. His throat constricted. He opened his mouth to give the order, but the words turned to ash. Ghost. Make the call. Torres screamed, looking at him with wide, desperate eyes. Do we move or do we dig in? Ghost. Vasquez yelled. Marcus stared at the dirt. The ghosts of Kandahar were pulling at his boots, whispering, stay, stay, stay quiet, don't speak, don't kill them. Bark. The sound was sharp, piercing, and utterly devoid of fear. Marcus snapped his head up. Grizzly was standing in the open, just exposed enough to be seen. He wasn't looking at the enemy. He was looking at Marcus. He barked again, a demanding, impatient sound. His tail was up. His ears were forward. It wasn't a warning. It was a challenge. Bark. Get up. Bark. Lead. Grizzly took a few steps into the open ground, bullets snapping the air feet above his head, then looked back. I trust you. Talk to me. Sarah Chin, huddled beside Marcus, grabbed his arm. Her grip was iron. Lieutenant, she shouted over the noise, her eyes locking onto his. We trust you. Get us home. The ice shattered. The fear didn't vanish, but the paralysis broke under the weight of the dog's expectation. Grizzly believed he could lead. Sarah believed he could lead. Marcus inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with dust and smoke. He found the soldier he used to be. He keyed his radio. Smoke out. Marcus roared, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Pop everything you have. We move on my mark. The team didn't hesitate. Torres and Vasquez pulled the pins on their M18 smoke grenades and hurled them into the open ground. 4 hissing clouds of purple and white smoke erupted, creating a thick, artificial fog bank. Covering fire. Marcus commanded. Vasquez suppressed that ridge. Alpha 2, get the package moving. Go, go, go. They broke cover. They ran into the smoke. It was blinding, choking, but it was cover. Marcus ran with his rifle shouldered, firing blindly toward the ridge to keep the enemy heads down. Beside him, a dark shape moved through the swirling fog. Grizzly. The dog was running at his heel, matching his pace perfectly. And he was barking. A steady, rhythmic barking that acted as a sonar ping for the rest of the team in the blinding smoke. I'm here. He's here. Follow the sound. It wasn't the sound of a broken animal. It was the sound of defiance. Almost there. Marcus yelled. Don't stop. The wind from the rotors hit them, blowing the smoke away. The Black Hawk was hovering 5 feet off the deck, door gunners pouring streams of minigun fire into the hills. Load up. Load up, the crew chief screamed, waving them in. Torres and Alpha 2 threw Rashid onto the floor of the cabin. Sarah scrambled in after him. Vasquez vaulted in, turning instantly to cover the rear. Marcus grabbed Grizzly's harness. Up. The dog leaped, landing in the cabin. Marcus dove in after him, scrambling across the metal floor as the bird lurched upward. We are clear. Go, go, go. Marcus shouted into the headset. The helicopter banked hard, G-forces pinning them to the floor. Through the open door, Marcus watched the LZ shrinking below them. And then he saw it. From the ridge line where the enemy technicals had been setting up, the position Marcus had almost decided to wait for, a massive barrage of RPGs slammed into the riverbed they had just vacated. The ground where they had been hiding 10 seconds ago erupted in a chain reaction of fire and earth. If they had waited, if Marcus had stayed silent, if he hadn't made the call, they would be ash. Marcus stared at the explosion, his chest heaving. His voice didn't kill them. His voice saved them. He slumped back against the cabin wall, the adrenaline crash hitting him like a physical blow. He looked around the cabin. Sarah was holding Rashid's hand, crying softly. Torres gave him a thumbs up, his face streaked with grime and a wide, relieved grin. And then there was a weight on his lap. Grizzly had crawled over the tangled legs of the operators. He collapsed onto Marcus, burying his heavy head into Marcus's tactical vest. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, his entire body going limp. The barking was gone. The tension was gone. Marcus peeled off his gloves with trembling hands. He buried his fingers in the thick fur behind the dog's ears. He could feel the rapid beat of the dog's heart slowing down, matching his own. You did it, Grizzly, Marcus whispered, his voice cracking with an emotion he finally allowed himself to feel. We both did. Grizzly didn't move. He just closed his eyes, safe in the noise of the helicopter, safe in the arms of his handler. They were flying away from the fire, toward the dawn breaking over the horizon. But as the adrenaline faded, a new realization settled over Marcus. The mission was over. The war was done. But the hardest part, going back to a world that expected them to be normal, to live in the quiet without the noise of battle to distract them, was just beginning. And as the sun hit the horizon, Marcus noticed something on Grizzly's collar. The tag was bent, scratched from the rocks, but still legible. K9 unit. It belonged to the military. And now that the mission was successful, the military would have a new plan for its assets. The rescue is complete, but the story isn't over. As the adrenaline fades and the chopper heads for home, Marcus is about to face a new battle, the bureaucracy that owns the dog who saved his soul. Will the elite communication K9 be reassigned to a new handler now that he's proven his worth? The ramp of the transport plane lowered with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a runway bathed in the pale, bruised purple of early dawn. The air at the base smelled of jet fuel and damp earth, the smell of safety. Lieutenant Marcus Ramirez walked down the ramp, his boots hitting the tarmac with a heavy, satisfied thud. He wasn't limping. Beside him, Grizzly trotted with his head high, the tactical vest dusty and scratched, a piece of frayed rope from the compound still dangling from a carabiner. They were greeted not by fanfare, but by the respectful silence of a base that knew exactly what they had just survived. The debriefing was short. In the Tactical Operations Center, the maps were already being cleared. Commander Stone stood at the head of the table reading the after-action report. He looked at the casualty count, 0. He looked at the objective status, completed. He closed the folder and looked up. For the first time in 3 years, the commander's face softened. He didn't look at the team, he looked directly at Marcus. The intel was bad, Stone said, his voice gravelly. The extraction was compromised. By all metrics, that operation should have been a catastrophe. It was the team, sir, Marcus said automatically. It was the call, Stone corrected. You made the call to move when everyone else wanted to dig in. That decision saved 6 lives. Stone extended his hand. Lieutenant Ramirez, welcome back. Marcus shook it. The grip was firm. Good to be back, sir. Outside the TOC, the formality evaporated. The sun was fully up now, burning off the morning mist. The team had gathered by the mess hall loading dock, the unofficial celebration spot. Captain Torres was already feeding Grizzly pieces of high-grade beef jerky intended for human consumption. The broken dog was the center of the universe. Vasquez was scratching him behind the ears. Alpha 2 was telling a dramatic reenactment of the IED discovery to a group of support staff, gesturing wildly while Grizzly sat there, thumping his tail against a crate, soaking up the adoration. He wasn't a liability anymore. He was the mascot, the savior. Marcus watched them for a moment, a coffee cup warming his hands. He felt a lightness in his chest that he hadn't recognized was missing until now. The heavy, crushing weight of the ghosts, the guilt of Kandahar, was gone. It had been replaced by the noise of his team laughing. Come on, buddy, Marcus called out softly. Let's get you out of that armor. Grizzly left the pile of jerky without hesitation and trotted to Marcus's side. Back in their quarters, the room was quiet, but it was no longer the sterile, suffocating silence of Chapter 1. It was a peaceful quiet. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Marcus knelt on the rug. He unclipped the heavy tactical vest, pulling it over Grizzly's head. The dog shook himself out, a cloud of Syrian dust flying into the air, and let out a long, happy groan as Marcus scratched the matted fur on his back. You did good work today, Marcus whispered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver tag he had ordered from the base exchange engraver 3 days ago, before they even left. He had carried it in his pocket through the firefight, a talisman of hope. He unclipped the old, scratched military ID tag. He threaded the new one onto the collar. Grizzly Elite K9 Communication Specialist. Marcus clipped the collar back on. The tag jingled, a bright, cheerful sound. He took the dog's face in his hands, looking into those deep amber eyes that had seen so much fear and yet offered so much trust. You know what you taught me? Marcus asked softly. Grizzly tilted his head, listening intently. I thought silence was safety, Marcus said, his thumb tracing the scar on the dog's snout. I thought if I shut up I couldn't hurt anyone. But you showed me that some wounds don't heal in the quiet. They heal when someone refuses to let you disappear. You screamed until I listened. Grizzly licked Marcus's nose, a rough, wet gesture of agreement. We're loud now, Grizzly, Marcus smiled, leaning his forehead against the dog's. We're loud and we're alive. 2 weeks later. The training yard was bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. A group of 6 new K9 handler candidates stood in a semicircle, clipboards in hand, watching with a mix of awe and intimidation. In the center of the field, Marcus moved with the fluid grace of a man who knows exactly who he is. He wore a t-shirt and cargo pants, his scars visible but no longer defining him. Control isn't about domination, Marcus's voice rang out, clear and commanding, carrying across the field without a hint of a tremor. It's about conversation. You are not operating a machine. You are partnering with a soul. He looked down at Grizzly, who was sitting at a perfect heel, watching Marcus's face. Grizzly, search, Marcus said in a normal speaking voice. The dog exploded into motion, clearing the obstacle course in a blur of tan and black. He hit the apex of the A-frame, crawled through the tunnel, and stopped at the scent boxes. He barked once. Sure. Decisive. Good, Marcus called out. Down. Grizzly dropped instantly. Speak. Bark. Whisper. Grizzly let out a soft, low woof that barely carried 10 feet. The candidates murmured in appreciation. One of them, a young corporal who looked as nervous as Marcus had felt a month ago, raised his hand. Lieutenant, the kid asked, how do you know when to trust the dog's voice? I mean, what if he's just barking at a squirrel? How do you know it's real? Marcus smiled. He walked over to Grizzly and patted the dog's flank. He looked at the kid and he saw himself. You know when to trust his voice, Marcus said, when you learn to trust your own first. If you're scared, he's scared. If you're confident, he's your radar. You don't silence the noise, Corporal. You learn to tune it. Captain Torres walked onto the field, holding a file folder. He stood next to Marcus, watching the candidates scribble notes. Nice speech, Ghost, Torres grinned. Just the facts, Captain. Torres handed him the folder. New orders came down. Deployment to the Horn of Africa. Counter-piracy ops. They need a lead element for boardings. Marcus opened the folder. He scanned the mission profile. High risk. High stakes. They specifically requested the dog who talks, Torres said, and the handler who listens. Marcus looked at the captain, then down at Grizzly. The dog was looking between them, tail thumping a slow, steady rhythm against the grass. We'll be ready, Captain, Marcus said, closing the folder. He looked at the dog. Won't we, Grizzly? Grizzly stood up. He puffed out his chest, looked Marcus dead in the eye, and let out a single bark. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a warning. It was a confirmation. Sharp, deliberate, confident. Marcus threw his head back and laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. That's my boy, Marcus said, clipping the leash onto the collar not because he had to, but because he wanted the connection. Loud and proud. They turned and walked toward the setting sun, their long shadows stretching out before them. Two warriors who had been broken by the silence and put back together by the noise. As they walked, Marcus's voiceover played, warm and resonant. They say silence is golden. They tell you to keep your head down, keep your mouth shut, keep it all inside. But sometimes the most precious sound in the world isn't the quiet. It's the sound of someone refusing to let the world stay quiet about what matters. The screen faded to black, leaving only the sound of a steady heartbeat, fading into a single triumphant bark. Grizzly was scheduled to be put down because nobody wanted to listen to him. They wanted him to be quiet. If you watch this whole story and leave without liking or subscribing, you're letting the silence win. Don't be like the kennel master who gave up on him. Hit that subscribe button and make some noise in the comments so more dogs like Grizzly can find their voice.